On a December afternoon in 1846, in the operating theatre of University College Hospital in London, a surgeon named Robert Liston stood over an unconscious patient and said 6 words that marked the end of an era of suffering so vast and so terrible that no one alive today can fully comprehend its scale. He looked at the audience of medical students and physicians packed into the gallery above him, held up his knife, and said, "This Yankee dodge, gentlemen, beats mesmerism hollow." The patient on the table was Frederick Churchill, a butler, whose leg was about to be amputated above the knee. He was breathing steadily through a tube connected to a glass globe containing ether, a volatile chemical that had been demonstrated as a surgical anesthetic in Boston only 2 months earlier. He was unconscious. He felt nothing, and when Liston, who was famous across London as the fastest surgeon alive, took his knife and cut through the flesh and sawed through the bone in 25 seconds flat, the patient did not scream. He did not thrash. He did not have to be held down by 4 strong men while his body was cut apart. He lay still, breathing, absent from his own mutilation, and when he woke up, he asked when the operation was going to begin. It had already ended. That moment, that single afternoon in December of 1846, divided the entire history of surgery into 2 eras, before anesthesia and after anesthesia. And to understand why that division matters, to understand why that single unconscious patient on a table in London represents one of the most important moments in the history of human survival, you have to understand what surgery was before that afternoon. You have to understand what it meant to have your leg cut off while you were fully awake, fully conscious, and able to feel every single thing that was being done to you. Subscribe to Historia Survival and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because this is the story of what it was like to be cut open before anyone figured out how to make the pain stop, and it is worse than anything you have imagined. Before 1846, there was no anesthesia. There was no way to render a patient unconscious during an operation. There was no way to eliminate pain. There was no way to make a person unable to feel the knife cutting into their flesh, the saw grinding through their bone, the hands of the surgeon reaching into their open body to find and remove what was diseased. Surgery was performed on people who were completely, terrifyingly, excruciatingly awake. They felt everything. They screamed. They begged. They fought. They had to be physically restrained, held down on the operating table by teams of strong assistants whose sole job was to prevent the patient from thrashing their way off the table and onto the floor. The range of operations performed under these conditions was itself limited by what the conscious body could endure. Surgeons could amputate limbs, because an amputation, however agonizing, was at least brief. They could remove superficial tumors, because these were accessible without opening the body cavities. They could cut for bladder stones, a procedure called lithotomy, which involved cutting through the perineum to reach the bladder and extract the stone with forceps, a procedure that typically lasted between 2 and 5 minutes and that patients described as the worst pain a human being could experience. They could set broken bones, drain abscesses, remove cataracts, and extract teeth. But they could not operate inside the chest. They could not operate inside the abdomen. They could not repair internal injuries or remove tumors from internal organs. The screaming, the thrashing, the absolute impossibility of keeping a conscious patient still enough to perform delicate work inside the body made these operations impossible. An entire world of surgical possibility was locked behind the barrier of pain, inaccessible until someone found the key. The sounds that came from an operating theater before anesthesia were sounds that haunted everyone who heard them. Students attending their first operation were known to faint, to vomit, to flee the room, unable to endure the screaming. Surgeons themselves, men who had performed hundreds of operations, reported that the screaming never became routine, that they carried the sounds of their patients' agony with them for their entire careers. The great surgeon Sir James Paget described the operating room of his era as a scene that combined the precision of a craftsman's workshop with the horror of a slaughterhouse and the desperation of a battlefield. The patients were not silent victims. They came into the operating theater knowing what was about to happen to them, and many of them had to be dragged, carried, or tricked into the room. Some fainted before the operation began, from sheer terror, and the surgeons counted this as a mercy, a few minutes of natural unconsciousness that spared the patient the first cuts. Others had to be drugged with large quantities of alcohol or opium, substances that dulled the pain slightly but could not eliminate it, and that added the risks of poisoning and respiratory failure to the already enormous risks of the surgery itself. The standard preparation for a major operation in the early 19th century was to drink the patient into near unconsciousness, strap them to the table, have 4 or 5 strong men take positions around the patient's limbs, and then proceed as quickly as humanly possible, because speed was the only mercy available. This is why speed was the defining virtue of a pre-anesthetic surgeon, not precision, not gentleness, not careful technique. Speed. The faster you cut, the less time the patient spent in agony, the less time they had to fight and thrash and disrupt your work, and the less time they spent in shock, the cardiovascular collapse that killed many surgical patients before infection ever had a chance to set in. The great surgeons of the pre-anesthetic era were measured by the clock. A leg amputation that took 5 minutes was considered average. 3 minutes was good. Under 2 minutes was exceptional. And the fastest of them all, the surgeon who could remove a limb in less time than it takes to read this paragraph, was Robert Liston of University College Hospital, London. The fastest knife in the West End. If you are already leaning in, subscribe to Historia Survival, because this man's story is about to take a turn that defines the phrase surgical precision in a way you have never heard before. Now stay with me. Robert Liston was a Scotsman, born in 1794, tall, powerfully built, with enormous hands that could grip and stabilize a limb with the strength of a vise. He trained in Edinburgh, where the medical school was one of the finest in the world, and he moved to London in 1835, where he quickly established a reputation as the most skillful and the fastest surgeon in the city. His operations drew crowds. The gallery of his operating theatre was packed before every procedure, not only with medical students, but with members of the public who came to watch the spectacle the way they might attend the theatre. Before beginning an amputation, Liston was said to turn to the gallery and declare, "Time me, gentlemen," and the audience would pull out their pocket watches and count the seconds. His speed was extraordinary. He could amputate a leg at the thigh in under 2.5 minutes. He could remove a tumor from the scrotum in 4 minutes. He developed techniques that minimized the number of cuts needed, that allowed him to sever flesh and bone in a continuous flowing motion rather than in separate, hesitant strokes. He held his knife between his teeth while he sawed, freeing both hands to stabilize the limb. He wore a dark operating coat, stiff with the dried blood of previous patients, that he never washed because the concept of surgical hygiene did not yet exist. And he operated with a ferocity and a confidence that terrified his assistants as much as it reassured his patients. His most famous individual operations became the stuff of London legend. He once removed a 45-pound scrotal tumor from a patient in 4 minutes, the patient sitting in a chair, gripping the arms, while Liston worked with a speed that witnesses described as almost impossible to follow with the eye. He amputated a leg so quickly that he accidentally severed the patient's testicles along with the limb. He removed a diseased femur from a young boy, an operation that would typically take an hour under the hands of a lesser surgeon, in a fraction of that time, saving the child from the prolonged shock that would almost certainly have killed him. His waiting room was perpetually crowded with patients who traveled from across Britain to submit themselves to his knife, preferring the terrifying speed of Liston's blade to the prolonged agony that awaited them under the slower hands of provincial surgeons. His mortality rate was remarkable for his era. Roughly 1 in 10 of his patients died, compared to 1 in 4 or even 1 in 3 for many of his contemporaries. The speed that defined his technique was not merely showmanship. It genuinely saved lives because every additional minute on the table was an additional minute of shock, of blood loss, of trauma to a body that was already at the very edge of what it could endure. But speed had its costs, and the most famous of those costs is the operation that has become a legend in the history of surgery. The only operation in recorded history with a 300% mortality rate. The details vary slightly depending on the source, but the core of the story is consistent. Liston was performing a leg amputation, working at his characteristic furious pace, his knife flashing through flesh, his saw biting through bone. In his speed, his knife slashed through the fingers of his surgical assistant, who was holding the patient's leg. The assistant later developed gangrene from the wound and died. The patient also developed gangrene and died, and a spectator in the front row of the gallery, standing too close to the operating table, was caught by the sweep of Liston's blade, which sliced through the tails of his coat. The spectator, believing he had been stabbed, collapsed on the spot and died of fright. 3 deaths from a single operation. A mortality rate of 300% because the patient, the assistant, and a bystander all died. The story has the character of a medical fable, and some historians have questioned whether the spectator's death from fright is literally true or whether it has been embellished in the retelling. But the core facts, the slashing of the assistant's fingers, the death of the patient, the extraordinary speed and violence of the procedure, are consistent with everything known about Liston's operating style and about the conditions of pre-anesthetic surgery in general. Operations performed at such speed, under such pressure, in conditions where the patient was thrashing and screaming, and the surgeon's knife was moving at the limit of human coordination, were inherently dangerous to everyone in the room. Liston's 300% mortality operation is the most extreme example of a risk that was present in every procedure, the risk that the surgeon's speed, the very thing that was supposed to protect the patient, would become a weapon that harmed everyone within reach. The world of pre-anesthetic surgery was a world that actively discouraged people from seeking medical help. Patients who needed operations delayed them for months, for years, sometimes until their conditions became terminal, because the terror of the operating table was worse than the terror of the disease. Surgeons reported that many of their patients arrived having waited so long that their conditions had become inoperable, that tumors that could have been removed a year earlier had grown too large, that limbs that could have been saved had become gangrenous beyond rescue. The absence of anesthesia did not merely make surgery painful. It made surgery a last resort, a desperate measure that people avoided until avoiding it was no longer possible, and by then it was often too late. And this is why the afternoon of December 21, 1846, matters so much. Because on that afternoon, when Frederick Churchill lay unconscious on Liston's table, breathing ether, feeling nothing, the entire logic of surgery changed. Speed stopped being the primary virtue. If the patient could not feel pain, there was no need to race. If the patient was unconscious, there was no thrashing, no fighting, no need for restraints, no risk of the surgeon's knife going astray because the patient moved at the wrong moment. The surgeon could take his time. He could be careful. He could be precise. He could think about what he was doing instead of simply trying to do it as fast as humanly possible before the patient died of shock or tore free of the men holding him down. Liston, to his immense credit, recognized immediately what ether meant for his profession. He was not a man given to sentimentality, and he was not known for his gentleness. But after that first operation under ether, after watching his patient wake up and ask when the surgery was going to begin, he is said to have been visibly moved. He understood that everything he had spent his career perfecting, the speed, the decisiveness, the ability to cut a man apart faster than anyone else alive, had been rendered in a single afternoon largely unnecessary. The thing that had made him great was no longer the thing that mattered most. Drop a comment if you are still here, and subscribe to Historia Survival so the next one finds you. Because the story of how anesthesia arrived is itself a story of tragedy, rivalry, and destroyed lives. The revolution happened with astonishing speed. News of the ether demonstration in Boston reached London in just 6 weeks, carried across the Atlantic by ship in a letter from the American physician Jacob Bigelow to his friend Francis Booth in London. Booth immediately informed Robert Liston, who, characteristically, did not wait. He arranged for a demonstration at the earliest possible date. The ether apparatus was constructed from Bigelow's description. A suitable patient was identified, and on December 21, 1846, barely 2 months after Morton's demonstration in Boston, Liston performed the first major operation under ether anesthesia in Europe. The speed with which the technology crossed the ocean and entered clinical use tells you everything about how desperately the medical profession wanted it. There was no lengthy period of evaluation, no cautious trials, no years of debate. The moment surgeons understood that a way existed to render patients unconscious, they seized it with both hands, because they had spent their entire careers inflicting agony on people, and they wanted it to stop. The discovery of surgical anesthesia was not a clean, triumphant moment of scientific progress. It was a mess of competing claims, bitter rivalries, professional jealousy, and personal destruction. William Morton, the Boston dentist, who publicly demonstrated ether anesthesia on October 16, 1846, at Massachusetts General Hospital in the event now known as Ether Day, spent the rest of his life fighting for credit and for financial reward. He had been working with a chemist named Charles Jackson, who claimed to have given Morton the idea and who demanded a share of the credit. Another dentist, Horace Wells, had demonstrated nitrous oxide, laughing gas, as an anesthetic a year earlier, but his public demonstration had gone badly when the patient appeared to feel pain, and Wells had been humiliated. Crawford Long, a physician in rural Georgia, had used ether for surgery as early as 1842 but had not published his results. The priority dispute consumed all of these men. Morton became obsessed with patents and profits and recognition. Jackson, who had a history of claiming credit for others' discoveries, fought Morton in court for years. Wells, shattered by his failed demonstration and by the success that others achieved where he had failed, descended into addiction and erratic behavior, and ultimately took his own life in 1848 at the age of 33. Morton himself died in poverty and obscurity in 1868, having spent his fortune on legal battles over the ether patent. The irony is almost unbearable. The men who gave humanity one of its greatest gifts, the elimination of surgical pain, were themselves consumed by suffering. They freed millions from the agony of the operating table and could not free themselves from the agony of their own ambition and disappointment. But the gift itself was real and it was incalculable. Liston himself did not live to see the full transformation his profession would undergo. He died on December 7, 1847, less than a year after performing that first ether operation of an aortic aneurysm. He was 53 years old. The fastest knife in the West End was stilled by a rupture in his own body that no surgeon of his era could have repaired, with or without anesthesia. But in the 11 months between that first ether operation and his death, he had seen enough to understand what was coming. The world of surgery that he had dominated, the world of speed and spectacle and screaming galleries, was already dying. The new world that was replacing it would be slower, quieter, more precise, and ultimately more powerful than anything he could have imagined. Within months of Morton's demonstration in Boston, ether was being used in operating rooms across America, across Britain, across Europe. Within a year, chloroform, a more convenient and pleasant-smelling alternative, was introduced by James Young Simpson in Edinburgh for use in childbirth. Within a generation, the idea of operating on a conscious patient was unthinkable, an atrocity, a relic of a barbaric past that no civilized surgeon could contemplate. The consequences of anesthesia extended far beyond the elimination of pain. Once patients could be rendered unconscious, surgeons could do things that had been physically impossible before. They could open the abdomen, they could explore the chest cavity, they could operate on the brain. They could spend hours on a single procedure, carefully dissecting, repairing, reconstructing, because the patient was not fighting, was not screaming, was not dying of shock on the table. The entire field of modern surgery, from heart transplants to microsurgery to neurosurgery, every operation that takes longer than 5 minutes, every procedure that requires precision and patience rather than speed and brute force, is a direct descendant of that December afternoon in 1846. Without anesthesia, none of it would exist. Without ether, surgery would still be what it was in Liston's youth, a desperate, violent, time-limited assault on the body, performed on a conscious victim who had to be held down while a man with a knife did what he could in the 2 or 3 minutes before shock and hemorrhage made further work impossible. The next time you go under for a medical procedure, or a dental extraction, or anything that involves a needle and a slow count backward from 10, understand what you are not experiencing. You are not experiencing Robert Liston's operating theatre. You are not experiencing the screaming, the thrashing, the straps, the 4 strong men holding you down, the surgeon with the knife between his teeth saying, "Time me, gentlemen," as he picks up his saw. You are not experiencing the world as it was for every surgical patient in all of human history before a December afternoon in 1846, when a fast-talking Scotsman with the fastest knife in London watched his patient sleep through an amputation and understood, in that single moment, that the era of agony was over.